Hi, I'm Sean Hutchison, CEO of ECOS and former U.S. Olympic swimming coach, and thank you for coming and listening today. So just recently, I was meeting with a group of coaches who came out to Seattle, and they were asking me about my pool company and the team that I own, and now ECOS, and I realized that I get asked a lot about how I created my quote-unquote empire. And I say empire jokingly because it doesn't seem like an empire. It's not really that big, but when I look back on my early 20s, broke, I didn't know anybody at higher levels of sport, I had no specific advantage, no backing, and no relationships. I didn't know an Olympian until I was even in my 20s. It actually is, kind of looking at that, a big accomplishment. And I appreciate people recognizing that, and even though it still sounds funny to me sometimes that I have a multi-million-dollar net worth, but it's true, and there's a pride in that, especially when you start from nothing. I also really enjoy telling this story because I really believe I'm no different from anyone else. And what I'm going to discuss here is the underlying theme of what worked for me. And hopefully it's helpful. I think it will be. So the story seems best told starting with when I first started coaching. I was swimming in summer league and started fairly late, but by the time I was 14 or 15, I started winning races, and parents of other swimmers on my team began asking if I would give them competitive lessons, their swimmers' competitive lessons to their kids. So I started doing it, and quickly I realized that I could make more money doing 3 or 4 lessons a day than I could lifeguarding for 8 hours. So I kept doing it, and I really enjoyed it, and that gave me enough time to train and play Nintendo. But without realizing it, though, I look back about 10 years later, and I noticed that was the beginning of my entrepreneurial career. And one of the big takeaways from that experience, even that first initial competitive lesson experience, other than starting a business without realizing it, was that I put a standard on myself. And that standard actually came out of insecurity. The insecurity of why in the world were these parents paying me to teach their swimmers? Who am I? But because of that, it was incredibly important to me that everyone involved, the swimmer, the parent, and myself, knew, without a doubt, that the swimmer got better every session, every lesson. And I'd stick with it until they did. And that act of making me the responsible party for improvement, not the athletes or some other person or some kind of perception of talent, was actually a lucky decision I unknowingly made, which benefited me my entire life. In discussion, I found that most great coaches take the responsibility for teaching skill as opposed to blaming the athlete or that perceived talent. The other takeaway was that you could learn to change things very quickly. Of course, you have to practice to retain them, but that an athlete can change, and they can change very fast, especially if you give them the right information. So anyhow, moving on, I swam in college and didn't do that well academically, and I kind of left feeling, my swimming career feeling bad, both about performance, but also about just myself. And I looked around and I saw that other people on our team kind of felt the same way in many cases, and didn't really have the best culture. And I have learned that that's more indicative of sport than it is particularly any one coach, unless you're lucky to have a great coach. But so at the same time, I was coaching in the summers, didn't know what to do with my life, and I just, as I was finishing school, I started coaching year-round. And as we know, coaching and even therapy, for the amount of work and schooling that therapy has, don't really pay that well, and especially when you're just starting out. And I lived on the floor, in the area I grew up in, around Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. That's not a profession that's really respected that highly. You have to go to law school or business school or maybe even be a doctor. But I remember going to dinner at a friend's house, someone I used to drive to practice when we were in high school. And, she was trying to be helpful and nice, but I'll never forget this. She said, "Sean, it really seems like you're floundering." And as you would imagine, that really kind of hurt. It didn't really feel that great to hear that, and especially with people that you respect. But I didn't really still know what I wanted to do, and so I kept coaching, and really focused on culture because I was looking at trying to said figure if I'm going to be coaching, well maybe I can give them something I didn't have, kind of have an experience that was better than what I had, and a hint in all of this, and I've tied it back to great performance over and over again, and especially the strategy or the way of looking at it that I would describe, but treating people with the same value is a surprising key to success. And what I mean by that is, in most cases, especially with the professionalization of developmental sports over the past generation or so, that a lot of times the one that's perceived to be talented, the athlete that's perceived to be talented, like the best one, will oftentimes get the majority of the attention, and the rest are kind of left to fend for themselves. And that creates a whole host of issues and problems, and you've read books on things like that as well as I have. But when you give everyone the same value, even if you treat them differently with how you interact with them, but they have the same value, there's a huge surprising component of success in that. And we actually had a lot of success. We had people make national teams out of a very small club, about 80 people. For those of you that aren't in swimming, an average-sized club is 200 to 400 athletes, kind of a medium size. So smaller is, to produce a couple national team athletes is a big deal. And it was fun and we loved it, but I still had a crisis. And I hadn't admitted or even acknowledged yet that I was going to be a coach. And I'm going to segue for a second here. And, in this, and that exploration of culture, all the success, any coaching success I had early on, in my mind was purely cultural and a little bit of luck, but purely cultural from channeling people's energy and focus. And, I happened upon this strategy by really focusing that I call functional expertise. And I don't know if I invented functional expertise. I'm sure I didn't. I don't know if that term is a known one or not, or whether I came up with it. But basically, in those first 2, 3, 4 years I was coaching, I really focused on culture. I read about culture. I thought about culture. I experimented with what I read and thought about. I talked to experts. I looked at different angles. I looked at emotions. I looked at selling. People think negatively about selling, but every great CEO, every great coach, every great therapist is a good salesperson. Looked at the energy of culture and so on. And, I think diving deep on that made me an expert. And that functional expertise is what the strategy that I have been across. And I continued that strategy. And I wish I could say I was smart enough to have thought of it ahead of time. But in retrospect, I figured it out over and over again, moving from first culture to then training to then learning how to teach in traditional methods and things like that, and repeat it even beyond that. And this definition, what I would call functional expertise, would be something like to learn deeply in one specific subject until you're as good or better than everyone in your landscape, in your domain. So if you're a coach, you don't need to be a PhD in brain science, although it may help. But you just need to know more about what the brain does for learning than the people you're competing against, if you think that area is important. And so in the same thing, if you're a coach or a therapist, you don't need to know more about business than Bill Gates. You just need to know more about the business than the people who you're competing against in your market. And to do this, you need to learn, you need to read, you need to watch videos, you need to experiment, you need to talk to experts deeply, very deeply, until you're better than your competitors. And then move on to something else. And why move on to something else? At some point, if you're a coach learning about business, unless you are becoming a business person first and a coach second, at some point you'll be functional enough to where the return of time investment won't pay off. And that's a generality, but we're looking at an overall mastery here. So you spend a couple years on one thing, 2, 3, 4 years on one thing, and so on. Move on to something else. For me, my functional expertise covered culture, training, teaching, I just mentioned all those, business, fluid mechanics and physics, brain science, and now technology and the business of technology. But to get the value out of it, you have to do the work over time. And most of those topics that I just gave that I went through, I did were over 2 years long. Some of them were 4 or 5 years where I focused deeply on one subject. So just as a note, a lot of my coaching success was also from this one thing strategy. And like for a season or a period, extended period, I would pick one thing. Usually the one thing we were worst at as a group or as a team that also carried the greatest likelihood for collective improvement. And we would all do that one thing every day. And everyone knew that one thing. And over time, you get really good at whatever that is. And for whatever it's worth, the athletes each had their own one thing and something specifically that was aimed towards their own personal improvement. And back then, I never termed it the one thing. So if you ask one of my athletes, they wouldn't know what you're talking about. But in retrospect, that was actually the strategy. And it's incredibly powerful. And mastering skills instead of kind of marginal improvement of skills. So back to the story. So finally I decided to coach. And I talked to some friends and mentors in and out of sport. And one very successful friend in business had some very specific advice. His advice was, you only have one life, decide what you're going to do, and be great at it. So just as a note, this is the most important action I've ever taken in my life. So I sat down with a pen and paper and wrote down the image in my mind of what I wanted to build as a coach. And I wrote it on a Twilight Zone Tower of Terror notepad. I wrote things like what my team would be like, what the culture was like, what their attitudes were like, and the attitudes of the staff, how we raced, even what our uniforms looked like. I envisioned being like a pro football team, not a high school club. My pool company, so we'd have more control over our destiny and also could employ better coaches so they could work both for the team and for the pool company and make better salaries. And I even remember envisioning like little details like how we walked into a competition. And for whatever it's worth, I was never a goal person before that. I had never managed a pool also. I didn't have a business education. I didn't have any money to do any of that. I just said, wow, if I'm going to do this as my life's work, I'm going to make this my life, and this is what I want to do. And I made sure I didn't put any barriers on it. I didn't put any limitation. I just said, if I had an empty slate, this is what I would create, so I wrote it down. And that actually set the wheels in motion. And people talk about this stuff a lot. But as you'll see, it's the combination of what I'm talking about that's powerful. And anyone can do it. So this combination is simple. Write it down. Write down what you want to accomplish. And then the second part of that is focus on one thing at a time and become a master at each of the big components to fulfill the image of what you wrote down. Really that simple. And for whatever it's worth, I didn't post stuff around my house. I didn't have Post-it notes on my bathroom mirror. I don't know if that stuff works or it doesn't. If it works for you, great. You know, it sounds a little bit much for me, a little bit cheesy, but I know that's it's valuable for some people. But if you're not like that, don't just automatically say, hey, this goal thing doesn't work for me. Look at the greater concept and how simple it is and how actionable it is, and just go for it. Oh, and one more thing on that. No timeline. That's actually the hard part. I think when people talk about grit, and I'm no expert, but when people talk about grit and all that stuff, I think what it actually is being stubborn enough to be focused without a timeline, focused over time without a timeline. So back to the story. So I moved to Oregon to mentor under a great teacher, and Bob Bowman hooked us up. He's Michael Phelps' coach, and we used to joke that we became friends before anyone wanted to talk to us. But he'll show up again in a minute. But I'm in Oregon for 2 or 3 years, focusing on teaching. I'm broke, mid to late 20s, and no idea if I would ever make it anywhere beyond what I was doing. My family asked me what in the world I was doing with my life. I even questioned myself, but I said, and this is probably one of the smartest things I did. I said, I'm going to keep doing this the best I can unless I find something else that I want to do more. So in other words, if I went through a period 2, 3, 4, even 6 months of feeling like crap, feeling bad about myself, being unhappy with my position in life, I just said, well, Sean, do you have something else you think you're going to do? And if the answer was no, then I said to myself, well, keep your foot on the gas pedal, keep working hard, because you don't want to turn around 2, 3, 4, 6 months from now and be upset at yourself for wasting that time and getting better. So if you don't know something else, even if you're unhappy, just get better, keep working on getting better, and you're not going to waste any time. And that actually is incredibly, I backed into that, but I couldn't advise that more than just about anything else from a day-to-day standpoint. It's really, really powerful. And I also recognize, that this is easier when you're young. I was in my 20s through that period. And, at some point in your life, you have to honor commitments, families and other things. But, you got to sit back and think, this is your life. Look at yourself, imagine yourself at 80 years old, sitting on your rocking chair and thinking, what did I do with my life? And if you're not on the track that you are going to be happy with, there's no better time than now to change it. And, even if you're a parent, and this is a different way of looking at it than many people think about it, as long as you can feed your family, what better example can you give them to set out on your own path of mastery and have the fortitude to follow through on it until it's successful? It'll not only change your life, but it'll change your kids' lives and actually everyone around you, even the people that are critical of you, it'll change their life if they're close enough. I can guarantee that. So I'm in Portland learning to teach, and up the street in Seattle, King County, which is where Seattle is, went bankrupt, and they were threatening to close all of their pools. And the coach of one of the better teams there in the area decided to leave. And I said, okay, I'll just apply for the job and go up there and take over some of the pools. Remember, I had no management experience, no money, but I saw the no money thing, me having no money, and I remember on my goal or my vision of my life, part of it was a pool company. And I said, well, these things are already built. I don't have to come up with a few $1 million, and I don't have to, build them myself, and I don't know where to get a few $1 million, and these things are already built. So, I went up there and decided I was going to talk them into it, and somehow we did. Well, that's a whole different story. But the powerful thing here is that if I didn't write it down 3 or 4 years before, I would have let the opportunity pass and said, oh, those suckers, their pools are shutting down, too bad for them. That's how I would have looked at it, because that's how we always look at things. And no doubt, if I hadn't done that, my life wouldn't have followed the same path. But because I had this image of what I wanted to create, I saw it as an opportunity and then had the courage to go up and try. So at that point, I'm in Seattle. I had to focus on the functional aspect of business. And it wasn't easy. I had no background in business, like I've said a couple times. And I was running a new team. I was a new head coach. But business was my focus. And we got a lot better as a team because I had mastered culture, and I had mastered teaching, and I had mastered training already. I didn't have to focus that much on those things while I was learning to do the business part. And I can't stress enough, it wouldn't have worked if I hadn't mastered those things previously. I own them. They were part of me. So we made it. We'd been going for 14 years now, the pool company has, and the team is older than that. And we've saved the cities we've served, that pool company, millions and millions of dollars. And more importantly, thousands of people learned to swim each year, and our team had a place to train. And we actually had some world records come out of there. And around the same time, we transitioned the club from being a nonprofit to being a for-profit. So I was the owner of the team at that point. And in parallel, like I just suggested, the team had achieved enough where I was going to world championships for the U.S. and eventually the Olympics and other meets, and had athletes doing some amazing things. And and that was only within a few-year period. And that really sounds like a lot, and it was sometimes. But expertise allows for faster action and faster thinking. So once the business began to calm down and get under wraps, I focused on fluid mechanics, focused back on my chosen path of profession and the physics of swimming. And what the work we did actually was published in the annual review of fluid mechanics in 2014. And we studied the flow of water around world-class swimmers, what really makes a swimmer go fast. And from that physics knowledge, I really understood how important movement was to athletic success and even health as well, but athletic success at the time, and that the quality of movement is really what determines success. And a great example, I always say, like Michael Phelps is as good or better technically than anyone he competes against. And so are the best in all the other sports. And you can get into style, but the physics components are there. Go do the research. You're not going to find anything different. Physics wins. So coming back to that responsibility thing from when I first started out, I understood how important teaching was. So when I learned this about physics, that it was even more critical to elite success, I started learning about brain science and the nervous system, hoping to find a way to help people learn more consistently or save time or something. I didn't really know what I was looking for, but I dove deep in on that one. And it ended up, after a couple of years, inventing Ecos Learning, which ended up becoming Ecos, the company, in the spring. The company started later, but the invention was the spring of 2008. And incidentally, we had an amazing Olympic trials. So I'm going to go back to Bob for a second. So life had progressed, Portland, all these things, a couple of businesses. And as I said, we were friends before, and we were sitting at a restaurant in Orange County, California in 2007. And he was at the top of the world. Michael was about to win 8 gold medals. He was the head coach at the University of Michigan. I had my couple companies. My athletes were doing great. And, after some wine and some discussion and reflection, we both realized we had done the same thing. Years before, we had both wrote down an image of everything we wanted our lives to be. And for both of us, it had all come true. Everything we had written down had come true. And it was in that moment that I understood how powerful the combination of this one thing with a comprehension of vision of life is. Truly amazing. One of the greatest moments of my life when I came to that realization. And kind of moving forward, in 2008, I was fascinated by Ecos. It was my new mania. And I realized I accomplished everything I wanted in the sport, and I had this thing, which from the research I believed would work with everything, even with people with neurological deficits, because that's where the components of the research came from, at least some of them. So using our tech, actually some of our partners are just now getting into creating curriculum to do this in a more formal sense. And I realized, and this is a personal thing, but I enjoyed coaching Olympians in a small group. I also enjoyed coaching 30 to 50 people at a time, like most of my career was. But the idea of being able to impact millions of people in a positive way was too much to pass up. So I sailed the ship and we founded Ecos. And incidentally, kind of part of this growth, and a lot of you who responded in the survey said growing your reach is really important. Part of what we created, actually, in an unrelated conversation, is to help you, actually enable you to grow your reach and impact more people from your expertise. But I created out of that a new vision that I'm living into today, and I like saying that word, living into today. And after all of this, though, what's interesting, follow your own path. But if I had to do it over again in today's climate, I would have done it completely differently. As in, I would have focused on other areas to build my empire while still kind of pursuing my coaching passion. And we're going to have a video out, another one out in a couple days. And in that, I'm going to tell you the cultural secret, which may be out there, but I've never read it in a business or in a coaching book, which I kind of kept to myself for a long time. And I first talked about it at a talk I gave last spring at University of Tennessee. And some of the best coaches in the world were there, and they told me they had never heard that before. It's very powerful, and it benefits you, and it benefits your athletes greatly. I'm also going to bring back some knowledge from the technology world, what I call the doomsday scenario. And in that survey we did a couple days ago, and again, maybe you responded to it, surprisingly, the responders said they believe technology will deeply impact sports and therapy in the future. And I'm encouraged by the understanding because it will. And after learning all that I've learned and being fortunate enough to see a lot of what the technology companies are aiming at, there is a doomsday scenario for sport and therapy professionals, which you really, really need to be conscious of. So we'll talk about that then as well. So down below, you'll see an area where you can make comments. Please do. Ask questions. Let us know what you'd like to learn about. And, thank you for listening, and recommend us, please, to anyone you think may benefit from this conversation. And most importantly, if you haven't done it, go get a pen and notepad, and get started and write down, the 360 view vision of what you want to accomplish. Take care, and thank you very much.